I've been working with data since like most of my professional career, so 15 plus years. And to some extent, purely selfishly, I always like wanted to have a better tool. And I almost wanted to build a better tool for myself. Like I always felt that like, there's so much stuff where like the most of the complexity is like less about like actually like building a prototype that works locally. It's like getting it into production, right? And like there's so much stuff around like scaling and scheduling and stuff where like it just gets in the way of delivering value. As well as the rest of the data stack, frankly. Like there's also a lot of stuff higher up, like, thinking at Spotify in particular, I built a workflow, an orchestrator slash a workflow scheduler called Luigi. So I've also like spent a lot of time like higher up in the stack and thought a lot about like different data frameworks and tools and systems. And what I realized was like a lot of that stuff is fairly fragmented. Data teams spend so much time on infrastructure. Eventually, like most companies, like once they get big enough, they end up like building their own data platforms, which is often like a thin wrapper around Kubernetes. And then data teams are usually not happy with that because it doesn't let them do a lot of the stuff they want to do. In particular, like now, I think that's very clear with like GPU stuff. It's getting very hard often for data teams to iterate based on the existing platforms. So I wanted to rethink the entire data stack. I realized like the best place to do that is really in the runtime layer. What I mean by runtime is like building the cloud infrastructure that executes code. Essentially building almost like a Kubernetes that's cloud native and focuses on the types of needs that data teams have. It's serverless, it scales up and down, like it does, builds containers very quickly, enables you to very fast feedback loop. So I started building it about 3 years ago, end of 2020. I pretty quickly realized like this is a deep technical problem. Like I have to go deep down in like, file systems and Linux and containers and what else is like, I can't do this on top of Docker and Kubernetes. So I'm gonna have to rebuild all of that stuff. And everyone thought it was crazy for saying this back then. But I realized actually like these things, like you can do this, like it just takes time. There's a lot of work, but you can have to, you can't go, someone built Docker. So clearly like, I can also build something equivalent. So started dabbling with that and pretty quickly realized like this is what I want to do. Like this is what I want to turn into startup and started hiring people in 2021. And now we're still relatively small. We're still 10 people, but definitely starting to feel like, what we're building makes sense.
So is it fair to say that like a lot of those infrastructural problems that you were seeing in your, past experience or other companies are going through, it's like you want to solve a lot of those problems and just sort of give a nice sort of runtime layer for people to sort of dive into and I guess get a lot of those benefits?
Yeah, totally. And like, I think like a couple of examples would be like, let's say you're like building a machine learning, some inference, like an inference endpoint. Like you have some model you want to productionize, like, like often like you can get that working pretty easily locally. Actually, it's not that easy these days with GPUs. But even, like once you get it working, then often like you have to rewrite everything or like rewrite like a ton of it in order to get it working in the cloud, right? And so I think there's this like huge like, chasm between like getting things running locally and getting things running in production. It's gotten a little bit better with containers, but in order to work with containers, now you need to introduce containers into your workflow. It's kind of annoying to have to like rebuild Docker containers all the time to run things. Like a lot of the like stuff we've done in the last like 5-10 years with infrastructure has like, maybe, enabled us to like bridge the gaps between local and production a little bit more, but it's actually made the like feedback loops like much worse. Like like in the sense that like like a couple of decades ago I used to just like SSH into machine, like write code, and like when I was done I just copy it into the production folder and like stuff like that. And like I think there's something to be said about the feedback loops that you had, when the production and cloud was the same. And so like to me, like my starting point was like I want to make data teams really productive, like and I want them to not have to think about this like production versus a cloud. So what if I can like take the local development and put the cloud inside of it, like that loop when you're writing code. Like I always thought that like if you want to think about like developer productivity, best way to understand developer productivity is in terms of these like feedback loops. Like you have this like feedback loops, and the fastest feedback loop you have is when you're writing code locally. So what if you can put the cloud inside of that feedback loop and have this ability to like, run things like super quickly. And then when you're done, you just deploy it because it's all like built in a way where like it runs in the cloud already. And that's what I was like realizing that's the key to supercharging developer productivity, specifically with like data tools.